If you've got a whole tank full of very roundish rocks, you'll find a lot less opportunity to put the coral. On the other hand, if you're going to have rock with a lot more shape to it, it'll be a lot easier to anchor the corals within the rock. It's really important when you're positioning your rock not to lay them flat, because basically your contact with the substrate is going to determine how much detritus you build up in your aquarium. So if it's flat on the bottom, you get a lot of gunk building up around the bottom of the rock. On the other hand, if the rock was positioned on points, then the amount of surface area contacting the substrate is much lower, and that's where your detritus builds up. So the garbage doesn't build up around the rock itself because there should be ample water flow in the aquarium. The garbage builds up at the base of the rock. One excellent tip with aquascaping is the use of a shelf. What the shelf does is minimize your contact with the substrate. So instead of using large boulderish type pieces for your support structure, what you can actually use is this shelf. We will then go mounting the decorative pieces of rock around the shelf, preferably hiding the shelf, and just using this for our support. From the time that you put the rock in, it will go through various color changes. It will go often through a powder brown stage, which is the diatom phase. It'll often go through a hairy green algae phase, but what you're ultimately aiming for is a coralline algae phase. Now that's signifying that the rock is very well developed and established. The color of your rock will be very much determined by the water quality of your aquarium. If you have a lot of phosphates and maybe not as high calcium level, your rock may be all hairy green. On the other hand, if your rock is very high in calcium without much phosphate, you'll get a lot more coralline algae growth, which is really what you're aiming for. It is quite wise to use gloves. When handling the live rock, it's not uncommon to find manna shrimp. They'll often pop out and land in the bottom of your box. If you do find them, don't handle them. Use a net and discard of them. Don't put them into the aquarium. Same as most crabs that you find, it's best not to put those crustaceans into the aquarium because as they grow up, they'll often cause trouble, particularly the mantis shrimp. Though something like 98% of them are absolutely harmless and just good scavengers, there's certainly been cases of them attacking fish as they are predatory. Once you've got your live rock, it's a really good idea to visualize what it is you're trying to achieve, and then you're ready to put it in the tank. While you're enjoying creating your masterpiece, don't forget to do a tap test, which is simply tap quite firmly on the rock as if you were a large grazing fish, just to make sure that your rocks are secure. This particular aquarium divides a bedroom and a lounge room. It's equipped with metal halide lights, which are responsible for this natural light shimmering effect. There are many different options as far as lighting is concerned. A lot of the time it's not really what's right or what's wrong, it's really what's relevant for the corals that you choose to keep in your aquarium. Now, providing different light sources in the aquarium wouldn't be unlike different positions within the ocean. You've got some corals that come from very shallow water that want very high intensity lighting. Then you've got medium and then deep water corals, which really don't require as much light. So the key is to really know what light it is you're providing over the aquarium and make sure you consult with your aquarium expert. It's just really important that you know what the requirements of the corals are that you choose to keep. Particularly with large aquariums, what I'll really try and do is offer as much range of lighting as possible. Therefore, you're more likely to be able to keep a more diverse range of corals. For example, if you've got 3 metal halides over your aquarium, don't have 3 of the same metal halide. Maybe have one 20,000 K bulb, one 14,000 K bulb, and one 10,000 K bulb, because you will find that various corals will grow better under the different types of Kelvin ratings. This particular tank has a combination of metal halide and fluorescent tubes. This is a really diverse and popular choice. What a lot of people will do is actually stagger their lights coming on and stagger their lights going off, which not only creates interest, but also simulates the natural sun up, sun down effect. So maybe they'll turn their blue actinics on in the morning, then stagger on the lights during the day until all the lights are on, simulating the middle of the day, then stagger their lights going off, ending with the blue ones going off late at night. As far as lighting duration is concerned, you're really trying to replicate a natural day. So you want to have a maximum of 12 hours of fluorescent light, and then with the metal halides, you're really only trying to run them for about 6 to 8 hours, which is emphasizing the middle of the day when the sun is at its peak. A very overlooked point that a lot of people get trouble with is forgetting to replace their light tubes. It's a really good idea to either document in your logbook when you've purchased your light tubes, or even just write with a texter on the light tube, because with time the lights do lose intensity and spectrum. In general, we try to recommend that we replace the fluorescents every 6 to 9 months, and that we replace the metal halides about every 12 to 18 months. So don't forget, the tubes are losing intensity and losing spectrum. So if you find over a period of time your corals are just not doing as well as they used to, I really recommend replacing the lighting. Particularly with these totally encased hoods, you really need to be conscious of temperature. So try to ventilate this area as much as possible, especially with metal halide lighting. So make sure the metal halide lights are about 30 centimeters off the surface of the water, and make sure they're in a very well ventilated area. This often means that you do need to install exhaust fans to suck out the heat. Now we're going to talk about fish selection. Probably the first key to having a good healthy tank of fish is to start with good healthy fish. When you go to the aquarium, look through the tanks carefully and make sure the fish are healthy. The worst thing you can do is start off with fish that are already sick. Make sure that the fins are clear, the eyes are clear, the fish is well proportioned, and it seems to be swimming properly and comfortable in the water column. Particularly if you're a beginner, I really encourage keeping a wish list. Now what a wish list is when you start the aquarium off, write down all the fish that you'd like to keep into the aquarium and narrow down realistically which ones you're going to be able to have in this tank. Then you can get advice from other people, preferably more experienced, about which ones are the best selection off that wish list. Because you'll quite often create a wish list of 20 fish and find that only 4 or 5 of that wish list are really appropriate for your circumstance. Now what we want to understand is that there is number 1, number 2 and number 3 fish. So you really want your aquarium advisor familiar with these terms. And when you go to buy your fish or your corals or your invertebrates for that matter, you want to ask the people, is this easy to keep? Is this a number 1? Can most people keep it? Is this a number 2? Some people can keep it, other people can't keep it. Or is this a number 3? Is this not normally going to work under most circumstances? So it's important to be aware of how hard the fish are to keep before you try to keep the fish. And then if you do want to keep the fish which are number 2s or 3s, maybe have some sort of understanding of what its requirements are, therefore making that fish more likely to work under your circumstance. The next consideration is when to put the fish in. In general, putting the scavenging fish in at the start is a good idea to help keep down your algae and make sure that the aquarium is relatively clean. And knowing that if you put angels in, it's best to put any angels you want in the aquarium in at one time. So the angels go in at one time, so they have equal chance to establish territories. Any tangs you want in at one time, so they have equal time to establish territories. Also with clowns, also with damsels, also with any other group of fish. Generally the various families are better off introduced in one day. So for an aquarium, you might say, okay, we'll start off with the clownfish, we put the clownfish in, we let them establish themselves in the aquariums. Then a month later, in go the wrasses. We put any wrasses we want. Then in go the angels. So you'll generally have less problems introducing the fish if you introduce the families in groups. So a tang now and then a tang later tends to cause more problems, more friction, more fighting than the same tangs at the same time. There's also a bit of a size of mouth rule. Regardless of how aggressive or peaceful these fish are, if the biggest fish's mouth is big enough to eat the smallest fish, you can usually bet that regardless of what the species of the big fish is, it will normally eat the little fish, because the fish are, after all, opportunists, and if the big one has an opportunity to eat the small one, that will normally happen. So make sure that your smallest fish are well and truly too big to be eaten by your bigger fish. You'll find too it's quite important to understand who the boss of your aquarium is. The boss's job is pretty much to control the other fish and make sure that there's not too much fighting in the aquarium. If your boss is very aggressive and is attacking the other fish in the aquarium, you really need to vote that boss out of parliament. So whether that means removing that fish or even putting something bigger in which might dominate that fish and then suppress its aggression. So watching the aggression of the fish you've got in the aquarium is really important, and remembering that if you get one that's a rogue, you're really better off sending it back to the aquarium shop as opposed to keeping it in your aquarium where you're likely to get ongoing problems. A lot of people suffer from a situation that I call the damsel trap. What the damsel trap is that a lot of people start with hardy, cheap fish like damsels, which really are a good choice to start with because they're so easy to keep, and they do tend to give the novices a good experience in the hobby because the fish are just so hardy. But also a lot of these hardy, cheap fish are also quite aggressive. So don't fall into the damsel trap. What the damsel trap is basically you start off with some hardy fish like damsels, they get very territorial in the aquarium, then you try and introduce other species later on and find that they don't last for very long. And that's because they're getting bullied, harassed, or even purely killed by the damsels. So if you can imagine a new fish trying to get established into the aquarium, it's already got some very aggressive territorial damsels in there, and the new fish becomes almost like a ping pong ball. It goes in, this damsel says, get out of my house. It goes over here, this damsel says, get out of my house. So then the new fish end up ping ponging around the tank. It can't actually establish a territory in the aquarium. It soon becomes stressed. It soon gets white spot or some other sort of problem, and the fish soon dies. Then you try another fish, and then you end up being under the impression that the only fish that work in the aquarium are the ones that you had in the first place. So one option is either take the fish back to the aquarium shop and actually trade them in, or sometimes just rearranging the rocks and disturbing the current territories is enough to allow the new fish to come into the aquarium because the old fish are just disorientated. When you get home from the aquarium shop, your fish will typically be in bags like these. It's best to demand that only one fish goes per bag because it's quite common for the fish on the way home to be quite stressed and actually beat each other up. If you are going to go for any length of time over an hour or 2 hours before you get home, also insist that the aquarium shop puts some oxygen in with the air which is in the bag, So what you're aiming for is about 1/3 oxygen and the rest cupped air. You don't need anywhere near as much water as you do air in the bag, because the fish don't run out of water, but they do run out of oxygen. Now the next thing you're going to need to do is acclimatise the fish from the water in the bag to the water in the tank. The way that you do that is by floating the fish in the unopened bag for about 15 minutes. The next thing we do is we open up the top of the bag and we roll open the plastic. It's really important that there's plenty of surface area exposed for oxygen. You really don't want to hang the bag over like this, because that chokes off the oxygen supply to the fish and will often kill the fish, particularly if they're left there for any period of time. So it's handy to use a peg, roll open the top of the bag so there's plenty of exposure to oxygen, and then peg it onto the side of the tank to make sure that plenty of oxygen can get into the bag. Once you've had the fish floating for about 15 minutes, what you do is check the pH and salt level and temperature of the water in the bag and make sure that it's the same as the water in the tank. What we then do is we scoop a bit of water out of the tank into the bag and we allow the fish 5 minutes to get used to that. So repeat this approximately 3 times or until your salt level, temperature and pH are very similar in the aquarium to the bag. Particularly if you're worried about the aggression of your fish towards the new fish that you purchase, it is a good idea to rearrange your rocks and corals a little bit just to disorientate the fish that are currently in the aquarium. This often distracts the fish and make them more worried about where they're going to make their new home. When it's time to release your fish, it's best not to pour the water in the bag into your aquarium, because on the way home the fish will stress and create a fair bit of waste in the water. So once you've discarded of the water, simply net the fish and then release the fish into the aquarium. It's really common when you first introduce a fish to the aquarium for it to hide amongst the rocks and not be particularly active. Particularly fish like wrasses also tend to hide under the sand. Probably the single most overlooked issue with a reef aquarium would be temperature, particularly when you buy your tank in winter and temperature's not so much of a problem. As the warmer months come through, you need to take some action. Now, whether that's simply blowing a fan over your sump, blowing a fan over the top of the tank, opening your lids and removing your hood, or taking the plunge and getting yourself a chiller. The only way that you can really get peace of mind with a reef aquarium is to get yourself a chiller, particularly if you have metal halide lights or totally encased hoods. The maximum temperature of a reef aquarium really needs to aim at 25 degrees. You can get up to 28 degrees and get away with it, but you really need to aim to get it down again as quickly as possible. As soon as you start getting up around 29s and 30s, you really will see significant losses. Now, the fish aren't as worried about this, so if you have a fish-only aquarium, providing there's a lot of oxygen in your aquarium, the fish are really not so affected. The fish are really more affected by the lower oxygen, because the higher the temperature goes up, the less oxygen tends to maintain in solution in the water. So if your temperature goes up, make sure there's heaps of oxygen in the aquarium, and you really should get away with it as far as the fish are concerned, unless it was extreme, like up around 34s or 35s. Oxygen will also help save the corals, because if there's a lot of oxygen in the aquarium, you do tend to get better heat dispersal. But as far as the corals are concerned, you really need to aim for them to be 25 degrees. Particularly for small aquariums, what people do in emergencies is keep frozen drink bottles in their freezer and drop them into the aquarium or sump just to help chill the water. Remembering how important it is to keep your temperature down, don't do anything overly extreme. It's better if you do things gradually to allow the temperature to fall slowly, because you don't want an extreme water change with cold water or something like that to drop your temperature because you've panicked and end up giving your fish white spot. Now I'll tell you a little bit about the corals. The first interesting fact is the coral is actually an animal, not a plant, which really spins people out because they look so cosmic. But the coral, being an animal, does actually rely on little algae called zooanthellae that grow within the coral, which not only give the coral its colour, but allows the coral to use the light energy as an actual food source. So basically, the coral is an animal, the coral has the little algae within it, which rely on light, so we must have enough light. We also must have enough water flow to wash away the waste from the coral and also to bring new nutrients to the coral itself. A coral is a sensile organism, which means it can't actually move. So wherever you position the coral in the aquarium is where it's pretty much going to stay. On the other hand, there's also fungi, which look just like a coral and excrete calcium carbonate bases, but they can move along the bottom. There's also anemones, which look similar to